This is episode 137 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones, lecturer in Shakespeare Studies at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Marlowe, as a gentleman, because he had an MA, was allowed to carry a rapier. Dueling was actually very fashionable then, and gentlemen would be expected to protect their reputation by challenging and accepting duels.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
History remembers Christopher Marlowe as a contemporary of William Shakespeare that was prone to violence. Arrested multiple times for his association with fights, duels, and even murder, scholars around the world have suggested that Christopher Marlowe had a hot temper which often ran him afoul of the local authorities in London. In addition to achieving a university education and the social rank of gentleman, Marlowe is the author of some of the most powerful plays in the English Renaissance, including Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, and the Jew of Malta. Undeniably a powerful force in England, as well as a huge influence over the life of William Shakespeare, the life of Christopher Marlowe is as fascinating as it is essential to understanding the life of William Shakespeare. Despite his reputation for violence, and certainly for including some very violent characters in his plays, our guest this week, Ros Barber, challenges the traditional assumptions about what we know of Christopher Marlowe to suggest instead that he is what she calls the James Bond in a doublet and hose for the Elizabethan era. In her publication, Was Marlowe a Violent Man?, she challenges the understanding of the cultural history for Christopher Marlowe. She suggests that what it meant to be a gentleman, the violent nature of corporal punishment in 16th century England, as well as comparing the recorded history of Marlowe to that of men like Shakespeare, reveals that the reputation for hot-tempered violence might be a posthumous application to Marlowe instead of the truth about the significant Elizabethan poet. Dr. Ros Barber is a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Director of Research at Shakespearean Authorship Trust. She is 3 times winner in 2011, 2014, and 2018 of the Hoffman Prize for a distinguished work on Christopher Marlowe. Her debut novel, The Marlowe Papers, exploring the life and afterlife of Marlowe, won the Desmond Elliott Prize and Authors Club Best First Novel Award and was longlisted for the Women's Fiction Prize. Hello, Ros. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for inviting me.
In her work, Was Marlowe a Violent Man?, Ros highlights that society in general was more violent than we think of today, with a cultural focus on sports like fencing, cited as examples of what might be called normal violence. Ros, with the general attitude of society being one that accepted violence as a matter of course, do you think the persistent suggestion of Marlowe as a violent man indicates he was involved in more than an average amount of fighting during his lifetime?
No, from the research that I've done, I would say that he wasn't particularly, he might look on paper like he was quite violent, but I think what's happened is that the manner of his death was so violent and has become so sensationalized. It's fascinating, obviously, and he was a pretty high profile poet when he got killed, but the manner of the death, the violent death, has then been used to kind of read the man through it. So it's been used as a lens subsequently, so that scholars go back, and A.R. Ralph said something like, well, obviously he was a violent man, so it was befitting that he died in a violent way. But actually, before he died, there's no indication in any documents that anyone thought of him as a violent person. And there are plenty of more violent people. I would say Ben Jonson, was a more violent man, but we don't think of him as a violent man because he died sort of fat and happy in his bed, old age. But he actually killed a man, which Marlowe didn't do. And he apparently put a man's eye out, or a boy's eye out, with his thumb. So I'd say Ben Jonson wins the award for the most violent Elizabethan stroke Jacobean poet.
Honan Park describes Christopher Marlowe's dad as being physically violent on the regular, saying, quote, his irascible moods became more frequent, as when he struck his apprentice and then got bloodied by William Hughes, a disgruntled employee, out near the butter market. Ros, was Christopher Marlowe raised by an abusive father?
No, we don't have any evidence that he was. I mean, he might have been, but we have no evidence. Park Honan was doing that thing that biographers do of having to make a lot of stuff up not all biographers, I would say, but biographers of early modern characters, because we've got so many gaps in the record that you really wouldn't have a biography if you didn't make most of it up. We don't have any evidence that John Marlowe suffered from irascible moods. We have two little incidents of violence. I don't know how little they really were. You probably wouldn't like it if you were the one hit by him, but he essentially was violent towards an apprentice of his, and then another young man, quite close together. Now, we don't know anything about this. One thing that I should say is that discipline, including violence. I mean, violence was a sort of sanctioned form of discipline in this society, and the head of household was expected to keep his household in order. That included your apprentices, your wife, your children, and hitting them was quite normal. I have to say, when I was growing up, hitting children was still quite normal. Hitting apprentices, a policeman would hit young men if they thought, they'd cuff them around the ear if they were giving trouble, kind of thing. So violence was normalised, even in my lifetime, more normalised than it is now. And certainly in Elizabethan England, it would be very normal to hit an apprentice. It's a young man that you're training. He steps out of line. We don't know anything about that incident. So let's just say, what if the employee had stolen from him, and then, John Marlowe was very angry and hit him, and then the person's friend, in the butter market, accosted him, and he ended up hitting him too. We don't know anything about it, but we've got no evidence that Marlowe came from an abusive family. And in fact, we've got quite strong evidence that Marlowe's parents were rather close and loving to each other. Park Honan uses this. He actually tries to make out that their close relationship was so exclusive that it drove the children to violence. So I think you can twist anything if you're a biographer with very little material.
So there's quite a lot of extrapolation happening here in terms of Marlowe's history. So let's take a look at the actual documents you mentioned that we do have. How many times did Marlowe get brought before the English court on charges of violence?
3 times he got brought before the English court. The first one was what's known as the Hog Lane Affray with William Bradley, where I would say he was not the aggressor and he was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. Okay, so, and then Holywell Street, there was some kind of incident there. We don't know what it was, but he was bound over to keep the peace towards the constable and sub-constable of Holywell Street. There's no evidence that fighting was involved. And in fact, what you would normally expect in a notice to keep the peace, which I have to say was also issued against several other poets of the era, including William Shakespeare, what was normally, there was a bit of Latin wording that you would expect to find in this notice to keep the peace, which is ob metum mortis, which is essentially in fear of his life. So you'd say, John Smith, in fear of his life, requests that this person keep the peace, right? But that wording was actually absent. And I would say that even more likely that the keeping the peace was about, not having a row, not shouting late at night, whatever it is. I've speculated, because the timing of this incident is kind of interesting. It's in Holywell Street, and Holywell Street was where Robert Greene lived at this time. And Robert Greene had, at this time, just put into print that Marlowe was an atheist, which was an extremely dangerous thing to print about somebody, because atheism was essentially a form of treason at the time because of the arrangement of church and state. I hypothesized in my novel, The Marlowe Papers, that Marlowe went round to Holywell Street to give Robert Greene a bit of a talking to, and then the constables were called and he was bound over to keep the peace. But, there's no evidence it was anything other than words. There's one more, William Corkine. So again, this is when Marlowe's life is falling apart a bit. It's after the accusations of his atheism, which would have been very serious for him. But he apparently went back to Canterbury, his hometown, and there was an incident with a tailor called William Corkine. Now, it looks like because of what happened. This wasn't in the criminal courts. This was a case brought against Marlowe in the civil courts by Corkine, and it was for damage against property. And it looks like what happened is that Marlowe cut his buttons off, which was a standard kind of dressing down. It's a bit like thumbing your nose at someone. So he was suing for property damage. And we know now, this has been since I published the article 10 years ago, we know now that William Corkine was very litigious and was really into taking people to court and trying to sue them for money. So he probably saw this former Canterbury boy made good, coming back in his fancy clothes and thought, I can get some money off him. I'm going to start a fight. I'm going to do something. I'll insult his family or whatever. And it ends up with Marlowe being dragged into court. So again, we don't actually have any evidence of violence against the person. There's no indication that he injured William Corkine at all.
So let's explore one of the other famous myths, I guess, about Marlowe and the idea of whether or not he participated in a sword duel.
Well, he did. And that's the first of the ones that I mentioned there, the three. The one that's called the Hog Lane of Frey. Now, it's been called that for some time. Ever since, I guess, it was discovered, the documentation was first discovered. But a fray suggests, it brings to mind kind of unruly violence, doesn't it? A bit like brawl. It's often said he died in a tavern brawl, and we now know it's not a tavern, it wasn't a brawl, but that phrase has just stuck. It looks like what we've been calling an affray was actually a duel. Eccles, the scholar Eccles, who was looking very closely into this, found out that it happened at the end of Hog Lane that was actually Finsbury Fields. And Finsbury Fields was a very popular duelling location. Marlowe, as a gentleman, because he had an MA, was allowed to carry a rapier. Duelling was actually very fashionable then, and gentlemen would be expected to protect their reputation by challenging and accepting duels. So yeah, he was involved in a sword fight. Because of its location, it very likely was a duel and not a punch up, not a drunken brawl or anything else like that. Yeah, so he was involved in a sword fight.
Well, did he kill William Bradley?
No, he didn't kill William Bradley. It actually looks like it wasn't even really his argument, because essentially what happened is when Thomas Watson turned up, his friend, who was also a poet and apparently a playwright, although none of his plays have survived. But when he turned up, William Bradley said, "Art thou now come, then I will have a bout with thee." And then if you look into the documents, there was an existing legal wrangle between Bradley and Watson, which started with Watson's brother-in-law, Thomas Swift, who was a lawyer. So what's happened here is that there's kind of some long-standing legal grumbling, and then posturing, and men being men, and especially Elizabethan men being Elizabethan men, and a duel ensues. And in fact, William Bradley had a previous record of violence. Marlowe at this time had not been involved in any violent incident, and he only fought for as long. I mean, we're presuming, because of Bradley's record, that Bradley challenged Marlowe. Marlowe had to accept. And then when Watson came along, Watson takes over the fight. So Watson then is the person that kills Bradley, but he is acquitted. Both of them are acquitted in self-defense, as self-defense.
So how long was Marlowe in prison? I mean, you said they were both acquitted, but did Marlowe and Watson get arrested for that incident?
Yeah, apparently, because we have quite detailed records of this incident. So apparently they waited, they were law-abiding citizens. It's a bit like, you crash into someone's car and rather than drive off, you wait, for the constable to arrive. You wait for the owner to come back, or you put a note on the car. But so they waited for the constable to arrive so that it all could be done properly by the book. And they both went to prison. Together they went to Newgate prison. Marlowe was only in for 13 days and he was released on bail. He was actually bailed out, we now know, again, quite recent additional research, by people that were government people, government contacts, right? So the government bailed Marlowe out quite early, 13 days. Watson, well, he hadn't killed anybody either, so that helped. Watson had to stay there until it went to trial. He was there for 13 weeks, and then they were both acquitted.
It seems incredible for our modern ears to hear that not one, but two poets were arrested on charges of manslaughter and murder after this duel leading to their arrest. Typically, we think of poets as being this very mild-mannered sort of person, which obviously doesn't mesh well with the image of someone that gets involved in these kinds of physical altercations. Why were two poets even there having this street brawl? Is that just a product of their gentleman status?
Well, again, let's not call it a street brawl because I don't think it was.
We'll correct that, yes.
I think it was a duel, which is much more of a gentleman's agreement, although I'm not sure William Bradley was strictly speaking a gentleman, but they certainly were, both Watson and Marlowe were, and they were entitled to carry rapiers. Let's look at poets in the Elizabethan era getting involved in violence. I mean, we've got Ben Jonson, as I said, was actually a murderer. He ended up at, he would have been hanged at Tyburn, but he could recite his neck verse, and England was so short of literate people that if you could recite a certain passage from the Bible, then you would be let off the hangman's noose, so long as the charge wasn't too serious, and just killing a person apparently was fine. So he got let off, and he had T for Tyburn branded on his thumb. Yeah, so violent, terrible Ben Jonson, who ended up obviously being a real favourite at court and writing court masques and the rest of it. We have Sir John Davis, who ended up being the Attorney General in Ireland and Speaker of the Irish Parliament. He was several times done for violence. He was thrown out of Middle Temple for hitting someone with a bastinado. Yeah, so and he was actually banned from Middle Temple for quite a long time when he was training as a lawyer. We have Thomas Dekker, William Rowley, Francis Davison, who was a translator of the Psalms. They were bound to keep the peace, like Marlowe and Shakespeare both were. Thomas Hayward also had a account of violence against him in the courts. So these are all poets and playwrights who, it was a violent age. You had to defend yourself. You know, you may not, don't assume that people were necessarily the aggressors. I know that I've looked quite closely into the John Davis case, Sir John Davis, because he was knighted by King James eventually. But when he battered a former friend, I think it was actually a friend he fancied, to be honest, over the head with a bastinado, it's because this person had publicly humiliated him about his status because he was the son of a tanner. So he rose from being the son of a tanner. Through his education, he ended up being, in an extraordinary position of power, being Attorney General of Ireland. Yeah, he wasn't afraid to bash someone over the head if they were speaking ill of him and trashing his reputation.
So comparatively, Marlowe's pretty mild. Yeah.
Well, I would say he's definitely not worse than anyone else. And unlike at least one of his very high-profile contemporaries, he didn't kill anybody. He managed to get away with not killing anybody. So it really was a genuinely violent age. There's a fantastic book. I got a fair bit of information out of when I was writing my article about Marlowe and his violence, by Alexandra Shepard, which is called Meanings of Manhood in Early Modern England. And it's all about manhood and violence, chiefly how you establish your manhood through being violent and how normalised that was in Elizabethan society at all levels. So she even reports at Cambridge it was normal, well, we know there's a little bit of this now, but it was normal for young men to roam the streets at night smashing stuff up. And there was even a report of a future bishop, right, a guy who ends up being a bishop. He takes holy orders and he's a bishop, but he was committing violent acts in Cambridge when he was a student. So, it really was a genuinely violent age. Marlowe was not by any means unusually violent.
Now, I want to ask you about the second of these cases that you mentioned, the one in 1592, where Marlowe is specifically cited as having used a staff and a dagger, which I thought was interesting because, as you mentioned, during the English Renaissance period, as a matter of course, gentlemen were allowed to carry a rapier. Why was that altercation using a staff and dagger instead of him just using the rapier?
We don't actually know, but I will tell you this. Courkeen was not a gentleman. He was a tailor. And Marlowe began in the same social class. So Marlowe's father made shoes, right? He was a cobbler's son. But so they came from the same class, which is sort of yeoman class, the trades, making things, clothes and shoes, etc. But Marlowe had risen to the rank of gentleman through his education, through getting the MA, and he was allowed to carry a rapier, but Courkeen wasn't. Now, a gentleman does not draw a rapier on someone who doesn't have a rapier. That's not a duel, is it? That's an unfair advantage. So obviously he's going to, if he's got to fight, if he's challenged to a fight, and we can't assume it was Marlowe who started it, because Courkeen seems to be, as I say, litigious and is quite up for a fight. But you fight with the same weapons that you have. And I want to mention the dagger, because the dagger sounds awful, doesn't it? It's like, oh my God, he had a dagger, what a violent man. Everybody had a dagger in Elizabethan England. It's how you ate your food. you carried a dagger around with you and you cut up your meat, and quite often you ate it off. Forks were kind of new Italian invention. They hadn't even really caught on. So you would eat with your dagger. You had your eating, and you wouldn't be sharing, keep it nice and sharp. Make sure you can cut your meat, and you don't share it around. You don't want anyone else's germs. You use your dagger for eating, and then if you have to, defending yourself in dark alleys at night. You know what I mean? It's like, it was a difficult time, and a man, not a gentleman, would always have a dagger. So a gentleman would have a dagger and a rapier. So we imagine that Coquin would have had his dagger on him too, and probably a staff, and it was just a fair fight.
Now, you've mentioned that one of the reasons Marlowe continues to carry this reputation of being a violent man in the first place were the circumstances surrounding his death in 1593. Ros, what were the circumstances of Marlowe's death?
Yeah, it depends how far back we go, really. There was a big sort of build-up to it. But in essence, on the day of his actual death, what happens is he is in Mrs. Bull's house in Deptford, which is not a tavern. Mrs. Bull was very well connected at the Elizabethan court. She referred to Blanche Parry, who was the Queen's nursemaid, as her cousin, right? Now, that doesn't mean they were actually like first cousins or anything, but cousin meant a very, very close relationship. So, and Blanche Parry, the Queen's nursemaid, essentially you imagine the Queen, that's like the Queen's adopted mother, because her actual mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded. So the person who nursed her and brought her up, and Blanche Parry was very close to Queen Elizabeth throughout her lifetime. Now, so Blanche Parry, very close to the Queen, and very close to her, Mrs. Eleanor Bull, who owns the place in Deptford where Marlowe ends up, apparently being stabbed through the eye, in very suspicious circumstances. So there's 3 recorded witnesses. We don't know of anyone else there may have been other people present. There's only 3 people recorded as present in the inquest. One is the person who killed Marlowe, who is Ingram Fraser, who was, well, let's just say all 3 of those witnesses were all professional liars in some sense or other. So I would say it's pretty split half and half between the academics who believe the inquest document and the other half who don't believe it, because, all the witnesses are professional liars, by which I mean 2 of them were Secret Service agents. One of them was described by the chronicler of the time, William Camden, as an extremely effective liar. He basically even says that in his chronicle. So that's quite extraordinary. That's Robert Poley, who was a key person in the Babington plot, who deceived Anthony Babington so much Babington could not believe that he was the double agent who was responsible for shopping him. But so Robert Poley was there. Robert Poley has been described by Charles Nicholl as kind of like a section chief or head of the Secret Service, right? So he's actually really quite high up in the Elizabethan intelligence services. Nicholas Skeers was also involved in the intelligence services. And Ingram Fraser also at some point in the past had been involved in intelligence services, as obviously was Marlowe and as was his patron Thomas Walsingham. And Ingram Fraser, who is supposed to have killed Marlowe, was a lifelong gentleman servant of Thomas Walsingham. So the whole thing stinks to high heaven, I have to say.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So that's why that sort of persists. It's got all of these questions. Where did you stand? You said that they were split half and half. Which side of that half are you at in terms of believing the inquest documents, when obviously there's so many reasons to doubt what they say?
Yeah, I think it's an absolute crock of lies. I'm being impolite there. One of the reasons, there's been an interesting thing about how the actual death is described. People have tried to reenact it. There's this thing to do with they were playing backgammon and they had their backs to him, and then there was a thing and there was a bench and it was pressed against him and he couldn't move. And all this stuff, people have tried to reenact it and they can't make it. There's no way. There was a conference a few years ago from the Marlowe Society of America, and they had a session where they tried so many different ways of actually making it happen, and they couldn't make it happen physically.
Wow.
And they've had, various things in which, like, someone who knows all about eye injuries and brain surgery saying, no, he wouldn't die. It said something like he died immediately, and it said, no, that wouldn't happen. And this. So I just think there's a lot to doubt. And these people are so, Robert Poley in particular is genuinely well known for lying. That's probably one of the things that marks him out. William Camden is not the only person that says it, because Robert Poley actually says it himself in a letter to the most powerful man in England, who was the Lord Treasurer Burley. And he says, I would swear and forswear myself rather than I would do myself any harm. He basically says, I would lie and lie again and unlie, so long as I got out of it. Scot-free.
So there's no reason to believe him at all. Yeah.
The interesting thing about it is it looks like he was brought in for this. There's no reason for Marlowe to have this weird meeting with these people, right? At the time, he was released on his own recognizance. He was kind of, I won't call it on bail. I have called it on bail before, sort of bail, but there was no bail money involved. It was legally, it's another thing. It's called he's released on his own recognizance rather than being released on bail. But essentially, a warrant had been issued 10 days earlier for his arrest. And he had reported to the Privy Council. He was asked to be brought to the Privy Council, and he had come, and he was supposed to be in daily attendance to their lordship. So he was supposed to be reporting in every day to them. There seems no reason at all. No one has come up with a viable reason why he'd be meeting these particular people in this particular place. But one thing we can say about Poley is that when he gets paid eventually for the period of time that covers Marlowe's death and the inquest 2 days later, it's written in that he was on the Queen's business all the aforesaid time. And this is unusual wording. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the payment documents. And he was on a mission from The Hague with letters of great importance. And it said they were supposed to be delivered in post, which means in haste, right? And yet there's some kind of delay where he's only a few miles from where the Queen was when he's in Deptford. And yet he then doesn't turn up there for another 2 weeks. So what is going on? It looks like, because Deptford that house has been described as a government safe house by the scholars who looked into what it was. What was Mrs. Bull doing? It's a stopping off point for agents to and from the continent. So it's at the point in the Thames estuary where you can just get on a boat and slip abroad. Poley was apparently, it looks like they may have literally been waiting for Poley to arrive there. And because he was on this mission from The Hague, and then he disappears again and doesn't go and deliver the letters to the Queen immediately. So what's he doing? There are lots of ideas. I think that's a whole another call. There's a lot around the death.
There is so much more to explore when it comes to this entire topic of Marlowe and his life and his death. I would love to ask you some of your favorite resources you can recommend we use, in addition to your publications, of course, that we can use to learn more.
Well, I said a couple of academic books, if you can get them easily and cheaply through your library, but the Alexander Shepherd book about meanings of manhood in modern England, just to get an idea of how normalised violence was, and there's so much fascinating information there. I have to say it's very readable. And another academic book, Roy Kendall's Christopher Marlowe and Richard Bain's Journeys Through the Elizabethan Underground, which is a fantastic book about spying, and goes much, much deeper into the charges against Marlowe for atheism and heresy and the shenanigans that he may well have been up to in defence of the Queen's life, I would say. There's this idea, spy, terribly scurrilous and untrustworthy. Well, no more untrustworthy than James Bond. James Bond in a codpiece, or actually codpieces were passé by then. It was more sort of like doublet and hose. But James Bond in a doublet and hose, you can see him potentially as a dashing person who was working for his country and trying to protect the life of his sovereign. Certainly that's what the letter from the Privy Council says in 1587. They actually defended him against a charge that he was going to go to the other side by saying that he was working to defend the Queen's life, essentially doing important business, touching the benefit of his country, and that people should not insult him if they didn't know anything about him. Sadly, he's still being insulted 400 something years later, but there we go. I would also say, it goes without saying, Charles Nichols' The Reckoning is the book, and it's cheap and accessible, easy to get hold of, a damn good read and very thoroughly researched. I don't agree with everything that Charles has concluded, but it's a fascinating book and very important to read, I think, if you're interested in Marlowe. I would just mention one more resource, which is not Marlowe related, but anyone who's interested in history at all. The University of Glasgow's Historical Thesaurus online, which is just brilliant, free resource, where you can find out how language has been used through the ages. So you put in a word, like put in the word for toilet, and find out how you would refer to that in 1563 or 1718 or whatever, what parts of a person's body, etc., etc. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, if you want to make sure that you're using the right language or that's something you're reading. How is that language being used at that time? So that's a great internet resource.
Those are great resources. Thank you so much for those. We'll be sure and link to Ros's work as well as these books and publications in the show notes for today's episode. So be sure to check there to find those. Ros, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, this is the hardest question of all, obviously.
Just one.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what the runner-up was, because I was really toying with the idea of taking Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, because I think that would keep you busy and fascinated for a really long time. And I've never sort of read it from cover to cover, only dipped into it. But I've ended up thinking that actually what I probably need is the complete poems of Philip Larkin. Extraordinary language, beautiful, just so condensed, so... one of my very favorite poems is one of his. But I think, could spend some time, could memorize things, could find new aspects of it. And I don't think I'd get bored of it. And I'd also be feeling very curmudgeonly, and it was pretty curmudgeonly. So I think I'd be in the right mood for Philip Larkin.
You'd be well set up there on your deserted island for sure. So what's next for you, Ros? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm working on a novel based on the life of the 18th century soldier, adventurer, merchant sailor and pirate Mary Read, who lived most of her life as a man, apart from when she briefly fell in love with a soldier and had to declare to him or let him discover that she was a woman. Briefly got married, lived as a woman for a while. Clearly didn't like it that much and went back to being a man, dressing as a man for the rest of her life. So, I'm coming towards the end of it. I've been working on it for 6 years now, and it's a bit of a tome. So I am very excited about it. I'm very excited about finishing it.
It sounds fascinating. Can't wait to see that. Thank you so much for being here, Ros, and talking with us about Christopher Marlowe and setting us straight about his reputation and life. Thank you so much. This has been a fun conversation.
Thank you, Cassidy.
Find links to Ros's work as well as more information on Christopher Marlowe inside the show notes for this week's episode at cassidycash.com/episode 137. That's cassidycash.com/EP137. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at cassidycash.com/experience. That's cassidycash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.